Good morning. The occasion for Ziva and my participation in this panel is the publication of this book. And I'm going to spend the few minutes that I have talking a little bit about the origins, my own involvement in this, some of the findings, some of the surprises along the way. This is a project that I began 20 years ago. At the time, this was roughly in 1999, it was on the occasion of the 20th anniversary of the signing of the peace treaty. And in my academic field at that time, is international politics, but primarily with an emphasis on international negotiation, on the combination or the linkage between diplomacy and strategy. I'd written my dissertation X number of years before that on US-Soviet arms control negotiations, in which those issues were laid out and how they interacted with each other. So I did deterrence, and I did game theory, and I did all sorts of related issues on that playing field. And I was asked to talk about I also ran a program at Bar-Ilan on international negotiations, or actually it was the program on conflict management and negotiation. I insisted it should not be called conflict resolution because I didn't think conflicts were generally resolved. And I still don't think so. But it was the 20th anniversary, and so I participated in a panel on the lessons of the Egyptian-Israeli peace negotiations. And on that occasion, I did quite a bit of reading. I taught classes that dealt with this. That was, and it still is. The peace treaty with Egypt, I think is very important to say, is since the end of the Second World War, and certainly at the end of the Cold War, is the primary successful example of an international peace treaty. Here we are now. We've just celebrated 40 years of the peace treaty, and it's holding with all of the caveats, which maybe some of the other people will talk about. And that's a remarkable achievement, and sometimes we forget about how remarkable it really is to be able to pull that off. And a lot of the skepticism that took place that was around at the time that this was actually going to happen. So I talked about that at 20 years. I talked about some of the inconsistencies that I found in the literature at the time, and until we wrote our book, I'll say. The literature was largely consisted of memoirs. First of all, the primary source material was memoirs. You had a lot of material. Carter had written a number of different versions, his own diaries, he published books, kept referring to it. William Quandt and other American actors, Brzezinski, all had written their own versions, which were pretty much reiterations and more detail, and perhaps one could say more academic elegance, intellectual insight, certainly in Quandt's work than in some of the other participants. And there was some Egyptian literature, and there was the Israeli contribution was also, you had Weitzman and Dayan's partly ghost-written memoirs, in which they were the heroes of the process of the negotiations, Weitzman also, and you had journalist accounts. And what was common into all of these was Begin as the reluctant peacemaker. Begin, in the words of San Luis, as having buyer's regret after Camp David. All sorts of examples of that, how Begin was isolated at Camp David, how the negotiations, and the agreements were imposed on him. And what's interesting in terms of Israeli politics is that this was generally agreed upon by right and by left, by Begin's critics on the right. Begin made these terrible mistakes, these terrible compromises with the ideology of Jabotinsky and the founders, and set up the basis for eventual Palestinian statehood because of his willingness to participate in this process, because he was isolated, and because he allowed all of these other people to make decisions for him and accepted them. And on the left, well, Begin really wasn't a peacemaker. He was really calculated that he would do this to hold on to Judea and Samaria, to the territories, and really wasn't involved in the negotiations. They don't quite explain how we ended up with an agreement on that basis, but that was the general narrative. There are a lot of holes in that narrative, and I talked about that back in 20 years ago. I looked at my notes, that's all, I don't remember the details, but that there were some things that needed to be unexplained. And the most important point was Begin, of all the primary actors, did not leave memoirs, did not have interviews, there was nothing there. So basically his voice was absent, and therefore this, what I will call for brevity, this false or artificial narrative of Begin as the incapacitated Rosh Memshala b'Matzor, that's I think the most well-known Israeli book written by two journalists as the prime minister in, how do you say Matzor? Under siege, that's right, that's the English translation. And so I began, and this was suggested to me by Yechiel Kadishai, or he suggested it to Harry Hurwitz, who built the Begin Center and was close aides with Begin, that somebody should do this, and since I already talked about this, I should do this. That's the origins of the book. And I said, well, you know, I'm not really a historian, and this is something that I'll take into consideration. It took 20 years or 18 years, and it took the very central role of Ziv in putting this together. I began by just going over what existed and looking and trying to pull out some of those contradictions. A lot of journalistic accounts at the time. I will say that it was interesting that I went through Haaretz, Yediot Achronot, Ma'ariv, and the Jerusalem Post. And what's interesting is the Jerusalem Post had some of the most detailed coverage in those days. There were articles almost every day. It was owned at that time still by the Histadrut, and it was shortly after the Mapach, the election of Likud, and so they had some very good reporters, and that was a good source. They were also go-to people for leaks and other things that now you might associate with Haaretz. In those days, the Jerusalem Post produced. It was also the newspaper of record for the foreign diplomats, for academics, for others, the English language paper. But putting all those pieces together, you see a somewhat different narrative emerging. Plus, again, things they didn't know about, things that all sorts of details which are in the book, which I won't get into. But obviously, there was a lot more missing. And in terms of the research, I think the big breakthrough was the fact that we began to get archival material, that the Israeli archives began to release in large amounts the material, the protocols, particularly from Camp David, but all of the meeting protocols and cables that went back and forth between whenever there were meetings. And you have a very detailed narrative. The richness from the very first day that Begin became prime minister, how clear it was that this was his primary goal. The way that he immediately picked up, he went and got briefings from Shlomo Avineri. I interviewed him at the beginning of this, and the detailed briefings. Avineri talked about the fact that, I think he used the term surprise, that Begin showed so much interest within the first few days after being elected prime minister in his meetings in Avineri's meetings with Ceausescu, and then also at with connections with Sam Lewis and the Americans and the 4th of July party, that would Begin prepared the process by which he would become fully immersed in working with and contacting Sadat. And you begin, in the process, we began to get the material, and Ziv did the archival work and deserves a lot of the credit, rightly so, in the beginning in filling in all those missing gaps and finding the Israeli version. Because, and this is something that, since my time's going to run out, I'm going to make sure I say this right. So much of the understanding among academics, historians, and practitioners is based on the American narrative. And the record that we see coming out of the Israeli archival material is so different. And I see that in some of the reviews, the difficulty of those people who have an investment. They just can't conceive of making the change. The fact that you also see, not just in the archival material, but by putting the pieces together, going through going back to the newspapers, that I was going to say the media, but in those days it really was printed newspaper, and you sit there with a microfiche and you go through and read these articles. But the domestic political atmosphere in Israel, and how much that played a role. The assumption was, and you see this also in Carter's version, that Israel was like the American system, largely monolithic in the sense that Begin was like Sadat in Egypt, like Carter, like a president. And Begin was very much concerned about his attacks against him, particularly from within his own constituency, from the right. Now, in retrospect, one can say he never was really threatened. He was the master of everything that happened in Likud, but in fact, it was much shakier than that. This was so fundamental, the withdrawal, the decision to withdraw completely from Sinai. If you remember the scenes in 1982 when the settlements in Sinai were taken down by force, and very bitter fighting. And throughout that process, Begin there were mass demonstrations. He was a traitor. The term boged was used. And how much that affected his own personal dealing with all of this. Ani Boget, he kept saying, Ani Boget, I'm a traitor, I who fought to get rid of the British, who led the Etzel, all of that, I'm a traitor. That is all missing from the accounts, largely missing from all the previous accounts. And that we were able to, I think, bring out in the process, that dimension. So that's one key dimension. The other key dimension, somebody should keep an eye on the time. You tell me, okay, I'm going to do 2 more minutes then. The other key dimension is the struggling that was part of it, is the struggle between the realism, or I'd say the ideological foundation. We trace it back, not in great detail, Jabotinsky, of course, and his whole history through the Gulag and through the Etzel, but all the way through as leader of the opposition, his role in the unity government, and that I think is also something that is original and new to this book. The evolution of Begin's geostrategic perspectives and the growth, the increase of the realistic aspect, as in contrast with, and then eventually, I think, surmounting to a significant degree the ideological element. And tracing that all the way through, not as a sudden change as of 1977, and all of a sudden he becomes prime minister, and he's in this atmosphere where he's influenced by the counter-ideological perspectives, which is what his critics said, but rather that there is a continuity. For instance, in 67, right after the 67 war, from the very beginning in the cabinet meetings, Begin strongly supports land for peace with Egypt. He strongly says, but his terms of peace are a complete peace agreement. And he's very consistent on that, not partial withdrawals, not like the agreements that were made and were the justification for his leaving the government in 1970, the disengagement agreements, Sinai I and Sinai II, under the Rabin government, but he insisted on and justified and spoke repeatedly in the Knesset and elsewhere and wrote columns on the need for a full peace treaty, the acceptance of Israel as the state of the Jewish people among the nations of the Middle East. Under those terms, he supported full withdrawal from Egypt, and at the same time rejected any significant change in the status quo in Judea and Samaria, in the West Bank, and he used the language of Judea and Samaria and the Arab residents of the land of Israel. He never would refer to them as Palestinians. And that struggle that he had in order to reach a peace agreement, on the one hand, but maintain this 20, 30-year history of realism coupled with strong core ideological red lines, were consistent all the way through. What we argue, and certainly I argue in the book and beyond the book, is that this was the only agreement. It's a little bit of a stretch to make this, but I will say that I cannot, given all of that history, it's hard to imagine a different agreement that Begin would agree to. Begin held out for these positions because they were so deeply ingrained within, and he fought for them. He fought primarily Carter, starting in the second part of the Camp David, mostly during the Camp David negotiations, then throughout the 6-month period. And that's also, and on this point I'm going to end, I think an important contribution. The negotiations didn't end at Camp David. It was certainly a breakthrough. But they continued for another 6 months, primarily because Carter kept insisting on more, giving something and more than something, creating the basis for the Palestinian homeland that goes back to the Brookings initiative, the Brookings program that was published, led by Brzezinski, and published before the beginning of the Carter presidency, and a comprehensive peace agreement that would include this Palestinian homeland in the process. He wanted to bring in Arafat into Camp David. Both Sadat and Begin, primarily Begin, said no, and he kept coming back in that 6 months on the issue of autonomy, and Begin basically said, I agreed to what I agreed to at Camp David. No buyer's regret, he didn't use that term, but it wasn't but I'm not giving any more. That was as far as I was willing to go. There's a lot more to be said. I think Ziv has a lot more to say on this, so I will end it at this point.
Okay, so good morning and thank you for being here. I'll try to be brief on telling you, giving you a zoom into some of the research that we needed to do here. So we do have a lot from the Israeli archives because they just opened virtually everything that had to do with Camp David. The whole boxes were waiting for me when I asked for them. I'm talking of many thousands of pages to then take my camera and just take photos of them because it's just too expensive to Xerox. And then also the Carter Library started opening up, although I do need to say the American documentation is very bad. There's very little. I can tell you, just now in the news, the Reagan Library is in the news because of the fire just out there. I can see there when I started going to them that Israeli material is very thin. It's usually blacked out. And also that happened with the Carter administration until the Foreign Relations of the United States came out, and then you have all of a sudden volumes of material that is out there printed, so it's very easy. You can access it from anywhere. It's free. It's a wonderful tool, but it's still not enough. The Camp David records are very thin from the American side. There are speculation that they have recorded everything. Every plant there was a microphone. So who knows if we'll ever get to see to hear more from the Americans, but certainly the Israeli side is very well documented by now, and this is the benefit that we had, that we could hear begging in real time with all uncertainties. Unlike Carter writes his memoirs, it's after the fact. He knows how it ended. Begging doesn't know how this ends. So this is basically what we had here, which is more historical view. Anyway, when I went to the Carter Library for the first time in 2009, I started collecting material and then came back to Israel. I was there and started reading, and then I came across one document from June 1979 where Begin asked the ambassador in Washington to deliver a message that he just made, a statement that he just made in Jerusalem to the White House, to Brzezinski, and through him to Carter. Now I need to go back for a second. Camp David, this is June 1979, that's 9 months after Camp David, 3 months after peace was signed. During Camp David, perhaps the biggest issue that came out of it and became public was a clash between Begin and Carter on what did Begin promise when it came to settlement freeze. On the last night of Camp David, on Saturday night, September 16, 1978, there was a meeting between 5 people in Carter's cabinet, Carter and Vance from the American side, Begin, Dayan, and Dayan, the foreign minister, and Attorney General at that time, Aaron Barak. 5 people were sitting there. Carter had you see my small yellow notepad. He had a large one where he wrote a few notes. The Israeli side had Aaron Barak writing because he was the junior there, so he was writing a lot of notes in terrible handwriting that he thankfully many years later typed actually, and then we have them, we can read them. But basically the conflict there was what did Begin promise when it came to freezing settlement in the West Bank, and Carter wrote to himself that he understood that he's getting 5 years of freeze. That's the interim agreement, that's the autonomy itself that was planned to stay for 5 years. That's eternity, of course. And then later on, every new settlement will have to be agreed by everyone. No one except Israel would want that, therefore, no more settlements. That would be the logic behind Carter's view. Begin said, and he wrote it to him in the next morning in the letter, said, absolutely not. I mean, I promised 3 months. 3 months is for the negotiations with Egypt. So in order not to embarrass Egypt while we're negotiating peace, we'll freeze settlements for 3 months. Side note, Israel also did not have any plans for new settlements for those months, so why not give something for free? And just seem nice. Anyway, the next morning after Camp David, this explodes in the headlines that Americans are blaming Israel for deceiving them on this. Deception is something that Begin really took hard. If Gerald mentioned that he was called a traitor by his own constituents, his own people who served with him in the Etzel, in the underground, the Americans saw him as an unreliable person, that he's giving different arguments at different times and just is not a reliable person. deceiving them. So they didn't really like it, and what happened was that this really bugged Begin for a long time. This is the context of this document that I found at the Carter Library. Anyway, what Begin writes, says here, he mentioned that this is another loop of this argument that Begin deceived them on the length of settlements, and he is saying that, I'm just quoting one sentence here, so this debate was laid to a final rest, that's a very traditional Begin way to put things, with the announcement a few weeks ago of the Secretary of State, Mr. Cyrus Vance, before a congressional committee when he affirmed that the obligation to which I had committed myself, again, for the settlements, consisted of this and nothing more, 3 months only. Okay, fine. Few problems here. Begin did mislead me in a way, because it's not an announcement, it's not in the Congress, and what else was not true here? I don't remember. And it wasn't a few weeks before. So starting to dig what exactly did Begin see that made him write this up is something that I was struggling for about half a year until I found the answer. It took a long time Googling and trying to figure out what did Begin see, and we found it. Eventually I found that there was a report by AP, Associated Press, about a meeting of the Appropriations Committee of Senate, again, not Congress, Senate, same building, but still a different world, where Vance was speaking with them. That was in late April 1979, a month after peace was signed, where he gave the first request of the State Department for the 1980 budget for, the U.S. aid. So this is the context. Oh, this is probably what he saw. I'm not sure that he saw this report or an echo of this, but this is what he saw. Okay, that's how I'm starting to fish. So I know when it happened. I know where it happened. Now I want to see, did Vance actually say that? Because we read his memoirs, and he doesn't say that in his memoirs. He actually sticks with Carter's view. It was supposed to be 5 years. How all of a sudden did he in real time say, yes, we agree, it's 3 months? So I started looking, I communicated back with the Carter Library, and I asked them if they have Vance's notes. No. He deposited them in Yale, his alma mater. So I approached them, I found their archives, and I asked them for the material. I needed to pay, of course, obviously. And I got his remarks, a statement, 20 pages long. I read it, not a word. Fake news? No. I needed to dig a bit more to then go find the records of the Senate meeting to see it. It took me a long time. Unfortunately, in Israel at that time, at least, I couldn't find any access to the congressional records. But luckily for that, I have friends abroad. A friend who's doing his PhD here in the United States. I found that his library had that access, and within a few minutes after I sent him the request, I got the whole transcript. I started reading it, 50 pages long, all of it. But the first 20 pages are indeed what Vance submitted. I mean, I already read that, not a word. It's in the Q&A, where he had a discussion there with Hawaii Senator Inouye, where he brings that up, Inouye brings it up about the renewal of Israeli settlements that just happened at that time. It's after peace was signed. And this is where Vance is saying basically, yes, we understand that this is where the Israeli commitment ended. So here we have all of a sudden the perception is that Vance was a very honest person, where he was saying everything, unlike, let's say, Henry Kissinger before him, who always kept something for himself every time he spoke with the Israelis. After he spoke with the Arabs, he always kept something for himself without telling them. Vance wasn't. He just gave them the protocol. This is basically what we were saying. All of a sudden, we see an inconsistency in Vance's own testimony. So that became an issue. But yes, we do know from this that Begin indeed promised only 3 months freeze, which became 6 months because of the enduring negotiations over peace. And Is it over? Do we have all of the facts already out there? The answer is no. As there's a famous song in Israel in Hebrew, "Od lo tamu kol pla'aich," which certainly applies here, because all of a sudden you have more and more material out. Just several months ago, William Quandt, who was on the National Security Council, the expert on the Middle East, and participated in Camp David, in the context of a workshop in Oslo, he published his records from Camp David, not the book. He has the book, but also his real notes. And in there, he has a note that anyone who's familiar, in his book, he mentions that one of the Israeli delegates came to him and asked him to tell Carter to separate Begin and Sadat from one another if you want any agreement made, because these two people just cannot negotiate seriously with one another. In these notes that he published earlier this year, he identifies that it's Aaron Barak who came to him and said, separate these two people if you want anything done. So this is something that we still would see materials coming out. Hopefully more American material will come out, and then we'll see if there's any changes in the story that we already have. But certainly the Israeli perspective here is much clearer now, I think, with documentation from the Israeli side. So this is where I'll stop with the story.
I'll start with a vignette. I've been with the field of Israel foreign policy for ages. I can't remember when. My first book was completed more than 30 years ago. And being a newcomer to the field, I decided I took the liberty of sending it to what I thought at the time would be the best place, and that's the Middle East series of Cambridge University Press. They held the book for more than a year. When they finished, they sent me a note saying that the book is excellent, but Israel does not, unfortunately, belong to the Middle East. I'm very pleased that something has changed. I hope something has changed. Something about myself. When I teach, I do two things. First of all, I'm introducing myself because there's so much personal history in what one does in academic. And B, I'm trying to share with my students nuggets, only nuggets, to take home. Not the real thing, not the structure, not the complicated story, but nuggets. And I'll take the liberty of doing that with you. And you're going to tell me whether you liked it or not. First, I was among my teachers was Saul Freedman there, who was really a mentor, the historian of the Holocaust at the time, who was playing with international relations. Very few people are familiar with that, but Saul Friedland had played with international relations in the late 60s, early 70s. I was at Hebrew University, he was a mentor of mine. And when the time came to go to do a PhD, I consulted Saul Friedland there. I went to the London School of Economics and I asked him, well, Saul, what shall I do? So he warned me, don't go to Israeli history, Zionism, etc. It's too complicated. Do something to do with the Brits, and I did just that, and I completed a PhD about the fear of bombing from the air and British politics in the 30s. More Brit than that. I came back to Israel, I joined the Department of International Relations, and for a couple of years I continued in my capacity of a British historian. And then all of a sudden I discovered that the documents, new documents are there, a couple of stations from my home in Jerusalem. And these were the documents, the Israeli documents. I fell into the trap and I'm very pleased to be there still now, after 35 or whatever years. Much cheaper to go to the public record office, to the Israeli archive than to the PRO in London. Now, this is the open side. The secretive side, so to speak, is my involvement with the making of Israeli foreign policy for many long years. I've been a reserve officer in the planning division of the Chief of Staff for more than 25 years. I was member of the founding team of the research Research and Planning Division of the Foreign Ministry in the wake of the 73 war. And I was involved in many other projects of the Israeli government, which really opened my eye to the reality of foreign policy and added a lot to my understanding of the past. I would strongly recommend anyone who writes about foreign policy to do something in the field. Then the result could easily be seen, and I easily see people who had that at the fingerspitz, you know, at the tip of their fingers, that they know what they're talking about. Nuggets. First, people should realize that what you heard about Begin and what I'm doing and what others are doing is a relatively new area of academic research. As a matter of fact, it started in the 70s, in the early 70s, with the two monumental volumes written by Michael Breacher, the Canadian political scientist, who wrote the two basic books, which are still there, about Israel foreign policy, semi-theoretical books, which are still there, still covering the entire field. The other book, which was written a couple of years later, was by Ron Kleiman, Israel After 40 Years, which is another comprehensive, though small book. And this is where I come. And it's really a surprise to note the absence of comprehensive analysis of Israel foreign policy. And I took the liberty of adding to the literature this book. The last point to be remembered is the sources, and those who spoke before me spoke about the archive. I was there with the new historians. I work with Benny Morris, with Avi Schleimet, with others. I turn out to be an old new historian, not a new historian. But we were working on the same documents, the same wonderful documents, which leave a lot to be desired. We know that the defense departments are not playing the game. The secret documents dealing with anything to do with defense are by millions. Try to find documents relating to Israel arms deal of pistols with Sweden in 1949. It's still highly classified in Jerusalem, so secretive. And I would just finish with the secret side of the saga, with a little-known book called The Stranger Would Not Understand by Aliza and Gershon Rivlin of Ma'arachot, where a whole book of 350 pages of code names used during the mandatory period is there. 350 pages of code names. Could you imagine? It's a wonderful side which said something about the poverty, the relative poverty of raw material concerning Israel foreign policy. Now, how to write this kind of a book was very complicated for me. I wrote 3 learned books which deals with specific topics based on newly released documents, which were very complicated to write, but still much easier than the project that I have undertaken later. I wrote a book about Israel between East and West in the 50s and 60s. I wrote a book about Israel oil diplomacy, and I wrote a book about Israel and the Vatican, Israel and the Christian Church, which was relatively easier if you compare that to something which Ilan Troen offered me, and that's to write a comprehensive analysis. How do I do that? How do I do it? This is not easy, because since the late 80s, early 90s, many books have been written about Israel foreign policy, dealing with bits and pieces here and there. How do you cook them together? How do you do that without ending up with a huge volume of historical account? I decided to do the exercise to to undertake the challenge, and the result will be will be in print in a couple of months. I started with the foundations, and I connected the post-48 period with the pre-48 period, something which many people are not familiar with, because the State of Israel was born not immediately. Ben-Gurion was there in the 30s, Yitzhak Ben-Zvi was there, other people were there before 48. They brought to the office whatever the historical baggage they had, and the historical baggage is really highly impressive. It started in the, I would say, 18th or 19th century with Jewish diplomacy, with the Shtadlanut. It ended up with the foreign policy of the Yeshuv, the Jewish community in Palestine, from 1917 to 1947. And the baggage, the historical baggage, is unbelievable rich. And you can really draw the line between negotiations, mode of operation, attitudes, etc., going from mandatory period to the State of Israel. I will just mention one example, relation with Jordan, for example. The entire saga of the Jordanian option, which is still there, started to be effective in the 20s. And the logic of the situation is still there. And the way things are done is still there, very much there. If you notice what Chaim Weizmann was doing and how he was doing, what Moshe Sharet was doing and how he was doing, it is very much Herzlian by tradition. So the story is a very interesting story about the historical baggage. Then I decided to break the foreign policy of Israel to three basic aims and follow the development of action taking on Aliyah, immigration, taking on oil, and taking on recognition as the three basic aims of the State of Israel going back to 48 and ending up by the 90s. The book ends with three case studies in which I spread over all what I've said before in the context of three case studies, as I say. A relation with the African bloc in the late 60s, early 70s. Relation with France from the early 50s to de Gaulle, and relation with the United States concerning the nuclear weapon, which brings the story very late, very important. I ended up with the break of the negotiation with the Palestinians in an epilogue which tried to put everything out. So that's the book. What can you bring home from the very rich literature that I had to read? And I read a lot. I mean, I have suggested readings in the book for each of the chapters, and it's reading by itself. Let's follow what Israel achieved and how it achieved, and what Israel failed to do and how it failed to do. I wrote a learned book, which is on which a single chapter in the book, in this current book, is based, and that's relation concerning oil. A state cannot live without oil. Truism, but nobody really followed the story. Israel's situation was terribly complicated because oil was basically an Arab oil, and B, the West did not cooperate with Israel. The result was that living in the Middle East, you were thirsty to death in terms of energy. And that has been one of the biggest weaknesses of the State of Israel for ages, until I would say 10 years ago. And even now it's not sure whether the situation is that simple, even with the discovery of gas in Israel. It's not at all clear how it goes and where it goes. The question that I put on myself was how did Israel manage? And Israel did manage. And the way Israel did it was amazing kind of a story. It had to do with relation with Iran, which developed not on oil. People are not familiar with the beginning, with the genesis of Israel's relation with Iran. It has very little to do with oil. Nothing to do with oil, because the Iranians did not have oil, and the oil that Israel got was from British companies. Part of it was brought from the from that area of the world, but Iran was not involved. Iran became a seller of oil only in the mid-50s, and the story goes that it had oil only in the 60s, late 60s, not before. So what Iran sold Israel was oil of others. And Israel managed to do that, and the big secret of Israeli-Iran relation had to do with money. With money. Israel was ready to pay for a long time high prices for the oil. And Israel was an excellent buyer, and the Iranians did not fail to take advantage of that. That's the secret of Israeli-Iranian relation. Nothing to do with Alibaba's story, with all kind of dreams, of fascinating story. The Iranians were ready to offer Israel the oil. Israel was the only state in the world in the 50s, in the early 60s, ready to buy Iranian oil. Amazing. It's an amazing story. The second way Israel managed to get the oil had to do with something which really is unusual for Middle Eastern experts. You're all familiar with the notion of let our oil be ours and not yours. The fight for independence, the fight for throwing away the international oil companies and getting hold of one's own wealth. Israel is a definite, totally different kind of a story. Israel really forced Britain to stay in terms of energy. Forced the British to stay in. The British were ready to leave Haifa. The British were ready to evacuate Haifa and to leave Israel with no oil in 1949, 1950. And Israel managed to do the miracle, forcing the Brits to stay. The way they did it was to play a poker game, a fascinating poker game, and to threaten Britain to nationalize the Haifa refinery. The British were at that time involved in very tough negotiation with the Iraqis concerning rights, concerning the money, concerning the wealth there of oil. And the Brits were fearful of an example set by Israel which would follow up by the Iranians, by the Persians, which happened 3 or 4 years later. But that really was effective, and the British was ready to play the game together with what was termed at the time the Vasco da Gama operation. I mean, bringing the oil from the Cape of Good Hope full and letting them go back to Iran empty through the Suez Canal. That was the Vasco da Gama operation, which saved Israel for a very long time. This is oil, and that was one of the major achievements of Israel. Everything started with oil, which is not true. Everything started with Jews. Everything started with Aliyah. Relation with Iran developed in order to save Iraqi Jews, in order to open up the border between Iraq and Iran and allow illegal immigration of Jews into Iran and from Iran to Israel. That was the secret at the time. And it was cheaper for Israel to pay the Iranian monarch a couple of millions of dollars in order to open up the gates, much cheaper than paying bribes to the guards of the border, and that really made it at the time. And this leads me to a major finding of the book. North American political scientists and many historians have been making the mistake of really putting so much, almost exclusive weight on the Arab-Israeli conflict in terms of Israel foreign policy. Israel foreign policy has become equated with the Arab-Israeli conflict. That was it. I found that the situation was much more complicated. Reading of hundreds and thousands, really thousands of documents, I envy Gerald and Ziv for having so little to read. I read really unbelievable. I'm an archive man. And it all proves that Israel was basically preoccupied not with the Arab-Israeli conflict. The Arab-Israeli conflict was a means to an end, not an end in itself. Israel leaders, Ben Gurion and the others, were busy state building. That was the name of the game, state building. The Arab-Israeli conflict had a part to play in the state building. But in terms of time, in terms of energy, in terms of the documents left by Israeli government, there is no mistake. And I was one of the only one who really read so much of it for a very long time, that state building was there. State building was there, and in order to understand state building, you have to understand how Israel acquired oil, how Israel acquired water, how Israel acquired so many other things. And that leads me, I have 1 minute or how much time? One minute. To a wonderful story about Moshe Sharet, which really proves my point and other points that I don't have time to relate. People at the Foreign Ministry at the time, members of the Asian department, were highly criticized of Moshe Sharet for what they say is blame to develop relations with Asian countries. And Moshe Sharet took the time to write a huge document explaining Israel's foreign policy. And he asked these people the question of, are you familiar with what really connect Israel with Argentina? So they say the Jews, the Jewish community, the largest Jewish community in South America was Argentinian. Geostrategic, vote at the UN, etc. Moshe Sharet said no. The secret is a 4-letter word, and that's it. Nobody knew at that time what he meant. And the answer is meat, M-E-A-T. The only source of meat for Israel for the decade was Argentina. So you want to make a point. We are really realpolitik state, and this has been with us for a very long time until the 60s and 70s. A different kind of mixture was developed there, and the story about Begin really proves the point. Thank you so much.
It's a real pleasure for me to review these two books today. I've long been familiar with the quality of the scholarship of Uri Bialer and Jerry Steinberg, and today I've been introduced to Ziv's scholarship. And I'm certainly not disappointed with any of the work that I have been reviewing. The two books are written from a somewhat different perspective. Jerry's from a slightly right-of-center perspective, and Uri's from a more centrist position. Since on the political spectrum of those who look at Israel, I'm right between the two, I feel a special challenge, but a very pleasant one, in reviewing the books. Let me start with Jerry and Ziv's book. I would suggest that if you look at the book carefully, Begin is clearly the hero of the book. And Steinberg, Ziv, and Jerry repeatedly takes to task, as Jerry already mentioned today, those analysts, especially in the United States, who downplayed the domestic pressures on Begin, especially from his compatriots in the Cherut movement and the Liberal Party. By contrast, Sadat is portrayed in the book as vacillating and weak, and U.S. President Jimmy Carter as, and I'm quoting now from the book, inexperienced and ignorant, and so obsessed with the Palestinian issue that he almost torpedoed both the Camp David summit and the process leading to the signing of the Egyptian-Israeli peace agreement in March of 1979. Now, from an IR theory perspective, again, Jerry and Ziv deprecate the approach of people like Herb Kelman, who sought to transfer theories of interpersonal family conflict resolution to the international stage, much preferring the two-level model of international negotiations, which looks both at the interaction between internal and external dimensions of international negotiations. As far as the Camp David peace process is concerned, I basically agree with Steve and Jerry on the thrust of their book. Where I disagree just a bit with them is the basic dynamic of Camp David. Sadat, who you remember, changed the name of his country from United Arab Republic to Arab Republic of Egypt, was, I would suggest, rather desperate for an agreement. If you go back to 1977, you had mass demonstrations in Cairo in January. And soon after that came an editorial in Al-Ahram which could not have been written without Sadat's approval. And the basic thrust of that editorial was, look, we learned from the 73 war that even if we surprise the Israelis, we don't win. And even if we could win, the superpowers won't let us. So under the circumstances, maybe it's time to seriously think about peace. So I would suggest that Sadat really was, vacillation aside, really interested in peace. Now, if you look at Jimmy Carter, again, somebody in a pretty weak domestic political situation. If you look at 1977, inflation was rising rapidly. His administration had become dysfunctional. It reminds you of a current president's administration, also somewhat dysfunctional. But he went out and said that there's a malaise over my administration. He brought everybody to Camp David to try to rectify the situation. So I'm suggesting he was in a very weak position. Now, Jerry and Steve mentioned this in the book. I'm just going to strengthen it a little bit. He was really in need of an agreement. Now, finally, in the case of Begin, again, as we all know, product of the Holocaust, and obsessed both with Israeli security and holding on to Israel's biblical patrimony of Judea, Yehuda, and Shomron, Judea and Samaria, as well as Gaza. He resisted attempts very strongly to station Egyptian police as liaison officers in Gaza. And under the circumstances, in order to get peace with Egypt and remove the most powerful country from the Arab alignment against Israel, he was willing to cede all the Sinai, as we know, the airfields and the settlements, as long as the peace treaty had Article 6, as was mentioned, which was absolutely critical, that in case of war, you know, Israel going to war, Egypt respects above all the treaty with Israel. Now, questions. And I guess the basic question is, from the book, because you describe it somewhat differently, what exactly did Begin mean by autonomy for the Palestinians? I wonder if you could go into that in more detail. Secondly, I would suggest that the Sinai II agreement was a bit more significant than you indicate. It extracted a promise from the Americans not to talk to the PLO until they recognized UN Resolution 242, made peace with Israel. And the stationing of the Americans on the Midland Gidi passes, I would suggest, was absolutely critical. Having served in the U.S. Army myself and have worked with PIPSI 5 and PIPSI 11, which is the radars which were used up there, that really, really, really important. And I think we should emphasize that. And again, a question on the Israeli Foreign Office, I don't know if you found this in the notes, that the Israeli Foreign Ministry apparently thought that Ceausescu, the Romanian leader, was really acting on Moscow's behalf. Ceausescu at that time had broken with Moscow. If you remember, at the time of the '67 war, he raised the level to full diplomatic relations with Israel at a time when everybody else was breaking them in Eastern Europe. Okay, just a few more comments. How serious was Carter's threat to withhold funding for the movement of the airfields in the Sinai without the linkage to the Palestinian cause? And just one more. Sadat had said that 99% of the Middle East guards were in U.S. hands. So I would suggest it was not surprising that he tried to work with the Americans the whole time. Okay, now moving on to Uri Bialer's book. Again, this is very rich, and I look forward to its publication in a couple of months, Indiana University Press. So please go out and buy it. That's my plug. As you heard, he explores a number of less-known aspects of Israeli foreign policy. And some of them I just want to mention that he didn't have a chance to talk about today. He lists the bribes the Jewish agency paid to King Abdullah in the 1930s. Although Abdullah, as you know, did enter the war in 48, albeit in a somewhat limited way. Now, the lesson here, I would suggest, and I heard this from a U.S. State Department official in early 1970 who was not politically correct, I should mention quickly. He said, quote, "You can rent an Arab, but you can't buy one." And that was the U.S. consideration, not politically correct in 1970. Okay, secondly, he gives a deep description of the story of nuns in a convent and their 47 pigs, if you can believe this, that almost caused a major crisis in Israel's relations with France, as the Israeli government feared an Ottoman-style capitulations arrangement with France, giving virtual sovereign control over French schools and convents, etc., in Israel. A third highlight of the book is the analysis by Uri of the rather skillful way, and I would say very skillful way, Israeli leaders, both Ben-Gurion and Levey Eshkol, managed to stave off U.S. pressure over Israel's nascent atomic energy program. And finally, I thought your chapter on Egypt gave the best study I have seen as to why normalization has not worked. And I'm going to go into that in a few questions. All right, now, I'm now going to portray a little bit of my political stance. Questions for Uri. You talk about Israel's reprisals to Fedayeen attacks in the 1950s, quote, could only contribute to the Arab world's hostility. What was the alternative for Israel? Just to sit back and take it? Okay. Secondly, Harkavy's assertion that Israel had become who's an American scholar, a pariah state, I don't think was accurate. As long as Israel had good relations with the United States and the democracies of West Europe, it really couldn't be pariah, but you might want to discuss that. Third, on the question of should they or should they not recognize China in 1954, it clearly would have hurt relations with the U.S. You had John Foster Dulles, who was by gut anti-communist China. There is a Herb Bloch cartoon from the Washington Post that some of you may have seen, where he holds up a dish and he says to his, at a dinner party, he says to his hostess, "My, what beautiful CHINA you have," because he so detested communist China. Remember, when the Egyptians did recognize China in 1955, the U.S. cut aid to the Aswan Dam. So not the only reason, but a major reason. Number 4, for your next edition of the book, which hopefully will be in paperback, so I can use it in my class, I'd like you to expand on Israel's natural gas strategy. You discussed in detail the quest for oil, and you talked about it today, but there's been a lot of ups and downs with natural gas to Jordan and to Egypt, if you could discuss that. Number 5, anti-Semitism in France. You talk about the foreign ministry of France in the 1930s, and I quote now, "A Jewish state would soon be a base for Jewish imperialism in the Middle East," unquote. Now, was this, and two alternatives I'd like you to discuss, was this pure anti-Semitism of the, quote, better Hitler than Blum variety, which was alive and well in France at the time, or fear of hurting French interests in the Middle East? So remember, France still controlled Lebanon and Syria at the time. And then number 6, again, in your description of the lack of normalization between Egypt and Israel, you give 3 reasons, basically. Islam, meaning Jews shouldn't rule over Muslims. They're only a protected people, dhimmi, not a nation. Number 2, the lack of progress in the Palestinian peace talks. Or 3, Israel seeking hegemony in the Middle East. So of the 3, if you can, and I know they all go together, which would you give priority to? And let me see if that is, okay. In the interest of time, and I want to give my friend Zach a chance, let me end here, and I look forward to your responses.
Disclosure, first of all, closing of the circle. Bialer was my PhD PhD advisor. I finished my degree with him at the Hebrew University 26 years ago. But I'm going to start with a few comments on the book by Steinberg and Rubinovitz. Talk a little bit about Ziv and Gerald's work, simply because they presented first. On the format of comments on what they wrote and a few additional observations that I'll bring in from my own familiarity with both the subjects of both of these books. Both Gerald and Ziv were with me at a conference in March earlier this year at the Hebrew University, the Truman Institute, on 40 years since the peace agreement. And somebody, I think it was somebody who should have known better, somebody fairly senior, came up with the comment that Begin and Sadat despised each other. And there were some, shall we call them notables, participating. One of them was the Supreme Court Justice Aaron Barak, former diplomats and ambassadors such as Dennis Ross, and also Kurzer. And they pointed out that that wasn't at all true. The men had no great liking for one another, but there was a certain respect there and recognition each of the talents of the other. So point by point, a number of, again, comments on the book. Yes, Begin was isolated. Certainly, it comes out very clearly in their book. Much of this we knew already, but the Americans viewed Begin as an odd duck. One recalls the National Security Advisor, Zbigniew Brzezinski, commenting about Begin that he was, even at Camp David, always dressed in black as though he were headed for a funeral. His isolation went much further than that, because ultimately, without the support of Ariel Sharon, champion of the settlers, he would not have been able to withdraw from the Sinai. He also had to withstand the assault of those to the right of the Israeli political spectrum in the Knesset, when Firebrand Geula Cohen of the Tria party railed against him, and all, of course, within the parameters of what was acceptable at the time. The dialogue was different as today, and nevertheless, Begin turns to the speaker and he says, "Mr. Speaker, please save me from Ms. Cohen." She immediately took the land of Israel from Mr. Begin. And ironically, of course, at least after Camp David, and he had the enthusiastic support of the left wing in Israel, which for him was a little bit embarrassing. These two researchers had, of course, the benefit of an archive in the United States that's particularly rich in documentation, the very pointed policy of the Carter Library, documents in a volume in archives. I know because I've been there researching skirting Camp David and researching a different topic of that period. I will say that the book is nuanced on Begin in a way that most other recent works in the literature are not. It provides a counterbalance. I think that that's very important. It doesn't matter whether you are or not sympathetic to Menachem Begin, but the perspective is very important to have. The interesting things that I found in the book, Begin's careful and pedantic preparation, as opposed to the disarray that Mark to make own advisors and other Egyptian policy makers. Of course, ultimately, all three of the leaders, Carter, Sadat, and Begin, had a great deal to lose were the summit at Camp David failed. It's remarkable when you go through the material to recall that Begin actually arrived at Camp David. Both leaders arrived at Camp David with wholly unrealistic expectations. Sadat did too. But one of Begin's misconceptions was that Israel was going to get out of this while it still retained not only its settlements in the Sinai, but even military bases right under the nose of the Egyptians, and the Egyptians were going to sign a peace agreement under these in these circumstances. A few words, of course, about Uri Bialer. Indeed, as Bob Freedman sweeping, I think, and since we know Uri Bialer's work intimately, shall we say, in the academic context, he goes back in time to a period that he had not covered, which the Zionist National Home began, and then, of course, the shock of 1929, and within a few years, that is, into the early 1930s, the Arabs and Jews had very accurate views, one of the other. One recalls Ben-Gurion's simple statement sometime in the early 1930s. We have come here, and we will continue to come here, with or without the agreement of the Arabs. Yet he also met with Musa Alami in Moshe Sheltok's apartment in Jerusalem, and told Alami, "We bring a blessing to the Arab people. They have no reason to oppose us." And Alami is famous for his response. He told Ben-Gurion, "I would rather that the land remained barren for another 100 years until we are able to develop it ourselves." But Ben-Gurion did not need that in order to bring him to a very, very pessimistic view of the future of relations with the Arabs. Where he mentions Amni Abd al-Hadi's words to Ben-Gurion in 1946, the warning, "We will fight to the end," and indeed that was the case. Professor Bialer mentions in the book that Israel was unprepared for the 1948 war. I would venture that there was a paradox that perhaps some future researcher would explore, because if the Israelis were unprepared, or if at least the Yishuv was unprepared for the war in 1948, then certainly so were the Arabs. And so it played out on the basis of who was less poorly prepared. Israeli diplomats, because Uri has dealt all his academic life with Israeli diplomacy. For Israeli diplomats, the losses of 1948, 1% of the entire Yishuv's entire population, brought about a fear of and an aversion to war, and a great circumspection regarding the risks. I remember one of the chapters of Uri's book of 1981, I think it was, Israel's foreign policy orientation. One of the chapters was titled "Greasing the Wheels of Aliyah," and of course that tied in directly with the subject of national security, because Aliyah, immigration to Israel, was so much an integral part of the country's national security. And yet, ironically, by 1949, Ben-Gurion had come to the conclusion that Israel would have to develop a military nuclear capability. Eshkol opposed this. Pinchas Sapir, Yigal Allon, almost everyone in the IDF, including Air Force Chief Tolkovsky. Golda Meir opposed it because he was afraid of what it would bring about in relations with the United States. But again, if Uri's perspective, if the net is far ranging, then it includes the episode with China, and the fear of an American reaction, of Israel's rejection of relations with Franco's Spain, the convoluted path to eventual diplomatic relations with the Federal Republic of Germany. And of course, he touches upon Africa, Israel's entry to Africa, on which I wrote myself. And so I too, in the interest of leaving some time, will stop abruptly right here and turn it back over to Professor Freedman, the audience.
The boss says we have to leave. Thank you all for